Hi, my name is Artyom. I've been working here with the Global Forecasting School as a summer intern at the Central Bank of Armenia for just over a month now. I've been working with some various economists like Mr. Douglas Laxton and other economists, and recently I was tasked with providing comments on a recent paper by Mr. Bernanke and Blanchard on what caused the US pandemic-era inflation. Before I start, I would like to give a huge thank you to Gohar, Asya, and Doug. Of course, they all helped me out in the creation of this presentation. Without them, I would not have been able to find these charts, make these charts, and even understand some of the concepts that I'm about to talk about. So, let's get started. This paper looked at the whole issue behind trying to find what were the root causes behind the pandemic-era inflation in the United States. Within the paper, Blanchard and Bernanke estimate a wage price system with short and long-term inflation expectations to answer this question. The measure of prices that they use is the CPI, and the measure of wages is the Employment Cost Index. In their paper, they've talked about how during the pandemic there was a group of people that thought that because the labor market was overheating in the way that it was during and after the pandemic, mainly after, inflation would kick off in the wages. On the contrary, the conclusion that Blanchard and Bernanke have come to in this paper was that it was quite the opposite. Prices were the ones that led the wages. They said that excessive aggregate demand set off the inflation, but did so primarily by raising prices given wages through its contribution to higher commodity prices and by increasing the demand for goods for which the supply was inelastic. In short, what this means was, as we all know, when the economy locked down, during this time the government provided some pretty hefty stimulus to its people, and when the economy reopened, there was pressure behind the dam, so to speak, meaning that people, because they were postponing their spending and combined with the stimulus, they had a lot of extra income, extra money to consume and to spend. But the supply for goods after the lockdown was inelastic, and it took time to rebuild. And this gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply was the cause behind the inflation. Now, we have no disagreement about that at all. In fact, that's how it usually goes. What's important here is to differentiate proximate from fundamental causation. Sometimes it works the other way around, where wages can lead the prices, as happened in the late 1960s, as we'll soon see. However, in most cases, prices are the ones that lead the wages. And more specifically, it's the CPI that leads the wages, especially in this case. The bottom line, however, is that the fundamental cause of inflation in this case was that the Fed did not raise its rates fast enough to contain the inflationary pressures and to prevent a higher inflation premium from being embodied in wage and price setting behavior. The hot labor and good markets suggest that underlying inflation would rise over time, as it did. So if the Fed would have been more forward-looking, incorporating this notion that we were in excess demand in both the goods and the labor market, and anticipated the implications of that, they probably would have raised rates a lot faster, particularly in 2021. Plus, importantly, it would have been better if they would have had something like the FPAS Mark II framework, where financial markets would have anticipated that they would be raising rates a lot faster in the future if inflation ended up being more persistent, as it did. So, the Fed, as noted by Larry Summers, stuck with the transitory camp or transitory story of inflation for far too long. They could have had a framework like FPAS Mark II, which emphasizes the important risks of not raising interest rates fast enough and inflation ending up being more persistent than what they might have thought in the baseline. That's why central banks need to think about this more as a risk management exercise, as Larry Summers has been indicating recently. So the first graph that we'll talk about here is simply a measure of the unemployment gap and unemployment. You can see Nauru by the solid black line. These estimates are from the Congressional Budget Office, and they go up until the period of COVID and the post-COVID era. So unlike the Congressional Budget Office, we made adjustments at the Global Forecasting School. Previous students looked through the period of 2020, 2021, and so on, and made assumptions about the fact that the goods and the labor market were in excess supply initially. And so what that means is that unemployment rose by more than the natural increase because of the lockdowns. Now, why would that be the case? Well, there's two very important reasons behind it. First one is that in the early stages of COVID, there was a massive amount of uncertainty that resulted in a big increase in precautionary savings, which reduced the demand for consumption goods, obviously, and a big decrease in investment. In addition to that, there was something very specific related to COVID where consumers would not consume their desired consumption bundle. An example of that is international air travel. Let's say I wanted to go on vacation to any country, let's say Greece, for example. Because the borders were shut down and the airlines were closed, I would not be, even if I had the money and the time to go, I would not be able to go because of those issues. As a result, that money would stay in my pocket, which I could use later. The idea there is that in virtually every model that has a variety of goods, for example, traded and non-traded goods, if you can't consume your entire bundle, and if your intertemporal elasticity of substitution is higher than your intra-elasticity of substitution, which is very fancy, but in simpler terms, that means that you're prepared to save for the international vacation and not substitute for a domestic vacation and keep that money in your pocket for a later date. Now, if you do this, this results in a further fall of aggregate demand compared to aggregate supply, understandably. At the GFS, we characterize that early period of lockdowns as being associated with an increase in the natural rate of unemployment, but not as high as the increase in actual unemployment. As you can see here, the actual unemployment, of course, skyrocketed compared to the rate of Nauru. Now, what does this mean? This means that there's pretty hefty economic slack in both the goods and the labor markets. The question is, though, what happened after that? Well, this is actually covered in a document we make here at the GFS called Not the Fed Teal Book. We think of the Phillips curve as being convex, and we imagine the vertical asymptote where prices start rising enormously in response to excess demand as a result of bottlenecks. This asymptote is effectively determined by the proportion of firms that are hitting their capacity constraint, and we imagine this proportion of firms as our vertical asymptote. You can imagine when lockdown ended, instantly there was an instant surge in demand, and demand came roaring back to at or even higher levels than it was prior to the pandemic. But firms were still locked down and only began to increase their supply gradually and gradually recover from the lockdowns, which, as I said before, created this gap in between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, during COVID, what I just said, if one was to think about it that way, that would result in an inward shift of the Phillips curve, and it would become steeper, which combined with an expansionary monetary and fiscal policy would shift aggregate demand out, when in reality the Phillips curve had shifted in and become steeper. We had to make these adjustments to the Nauru and the potential. These kind of adjustments are actually quite standard for flexible inflation targeting central banks. For example, Evie Tronk, who recently put out a video on the New Zealand monetary policy framework, talks about how they make these adjustments at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand all the time. And looking at the chart, it's visible that the black line goes up a little bit during the global financial crisis. Again, these are estimates from the Congressional Budget Office. They don't typically make these kind of ad hoc adjustments to it, but they did during the GFC. They just didn't do it enough during COVID. Our view is that obviously you must do this if you're going to use these estimates to tell a story about policy. Because otherwise, if you didn't adjust, you'd think that there was way too much excess supply in the economy and too much economic slack. And the implication of that would be that you should do expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. Thus, making these adjustments is much more consistent with what we think the appropriate policy is and was, looking with retrospect to that current situation. Since looking at the prices, we look at the prices a little bit differently. Like, many flexible inflation targeting central banks, we like to decompose the idea of CPI inflation into not only CPI inflation in general. We like to decompose inflation into sticky and flexible prices. The reason we think about it that way is that in the best scenario, we want to be targeting the stickiest price in the market. And we want to be allowing flexible prices to adjust to facilitate resource allocation in the economy. Now, if you imagine we have multiple different sized rocks and we need to carry them up a hill, for example. If we can carry the biggest and the heaviest rock up the hill with whatever machinery we have, then the smaller ones will obviously be much easier. That's the logic behind targeting the stickiest price, or at least some of the stickiest prices. We think of these flexible prices as prices that respond to individual demand and supply in their particular markets. Flexible prices are sometimes a function of idiosyncratic things that are affecting specific components of flexible prices. And as Bernanke and Blanchard have noted in their paper, they can also be a function of excess demand and supply conditions. So if we look at this chart from the Atlanta Fed, which is just breaking down the CPI, we can see that they basically looked at those prices that are set infrequently, and infrequently means prices that are typically only changed after 4 months or more. And this means that since the price setters don't change their price very often, when deciding their price, they sit down and think of various factors that will decide their future price. They look at how much the price is rising in the market, the overall situation, the market condition, and their predictions for the future, meaning that this measure of sticky inflation can be correlated and can be sometimes a good proxy for long-term inflation expectations. The critical cutoff in the Atlanta Fed survey is prices that are set on an interval of more than 4 months. And of course, flexible prices are prices that are set in smaller intervals than that. Anything longer than 4 months will be considered to be a sticky price. According to the Atlanta Fed, 70%, which is, if you think about it, is a pretty large majority, 70% of the CPI is the sticky prices that I was just talking about. So we can look at this chart on the screen. We see the orange line is the flexible prices based on year-on-year percent change, and the black line is the year-on-year percent change of sticky prices. These two indicators combined compose the entire CPI. So what are we looking at here? Well, it tells a story of various things about the US economy and its history. If we, for example, we look at the 1973 and 74 oil crisis, where oil prices quadrupled, sticky price inflation actually went up quite significantly. When inflation came back down because of this tighter monetary policy and because some of the supply shocks reversed and oil prices fell, you can see that long-term sticky price inflation came down significantly to just above 6%. Then when oil prices increased again, and this time underlying inflation really takes off, it creates a fool me twice kind of story. So you can see the sticky price inflation ratchet up for the second time. It's ratcheting up, being faster in 1979 during the second shock compared to the original shock in 73-74. Now, for people to truly understand the inflation process in the US, it didn't start in 1973-74. It started in the late 60s. As you can see in the chart, if we go back to late 60s and early 70s, we already had sticky price inflation creeping up. The only difference was that sticky price inflation in that case was actually going up a little bit greater than flexible price inflation. Sticky prices, to just a quick sidetrack, sticky prices here can also be pretty well correlated with the 10-year bond rate, because just like the sticky prices, the 10-year bond rate is based on long-term predictions, and that's why it's also, if you look at the 10-year bond rate graph, it's pretty similar to this one, and it's pretty well connected, which is important for something we'll get into later. So this shows that what I said, that in the early 70s and late 60s, sticky price inflation was moving more, it was more volatile than flexible price inflation. This is important because it shows that it doesn't always have to be the case necessarily that flexible prices have to be more volatile. That was a period where the opposite was true. This can really tie into what's known as the Granger causality, effectively showing that in most cases, taking out the exceptions from the universal dataset, the change in flexible prices come first. However, sometimes the exception can be true where sticky price changes come first. So moving on, we get the Volcker disinflation in 1980 that results in massive economic slack, causing the unemployment rate to go up to double digits, and in the 1981 recession causing even more economic slack. Now this slack consequently results in inflation declining, causing a scenario where you see flexible prices fall by more than sticky price inflation again, and you see inflation fall down to a little bit lower than 5%. When the 1987 stock market crash happens, where not only the Fed but all major country central banks, all major advanced country central banks, coordinated a fairly large monetary policy expansion, which provided lots of liquidity. And looking at the chart, that resulted in some excess demand during that period where inflation just kind of ticked up before 1990. And in 1990, interest rates were raised again in a second attempt to reduce inflation to a more desirable level at the time when, if you remember from the previous graph, the unemployment gap was positive. The disinflation process in the United States occurred in two periods, one in the early 1980s, and which this period brought inflation down to just below 5%, and the second one in the early 1990s when underlying inflation creeped down to just about 2.5. It's important to note that an increase of 2.5% is consistent with a core PCE of 2%. If one was to look at the inflation dashboard created by the Atlanta Fed, it shows that a 2.5% historically would be consistent with the 2% target. After this period, you can see on our chart, underlying inflation just oscillates around 2.5%, which is essentially what we want in monetary policy. What to do is we want to anchor sticky inflation and allow these flexible prices to adjust on their own. During COVID, we had various shocks to demand and supply affecting individual goods. In this case, flexible prices shot up first, followed by the increase in sticky prices after some lag. Now this ties in perfectly with the wages. If one looks at the Atlanta Fed sticky price measure of inflation and compares it with the Atlanta Fed wage tracker, a clear correlation is visible. The wage tracker is a measure of wage that was emphasized in Larry Summers' 2022 paper. This is the one that I chose to report in the chart. He also referred to the quarterly earnings as well as the employment cost index. Now, we have a significant preference for a median measure of wages because all the problems that are associated with things like quarterly earnings, and in the case of the ECI, turns out that it's actually very costly to construct a reliable measure of wages. It's not something that's discussed about very openly, but if we compare the employment cost index, this measure of wages, and the quarterly earnings, we can see that there's a pretty big difference. And these issues are caused by various things in so much that it's hard to measure something with a survey. And when you talk to an expert, the number of potential measurement errors, according to them, are enormous when measuring wages. So that's why we prefer to look at the median wage increase. That way we can abstract from measurement errors, and we can also avoid the pitfall of looking at a sample that's not representative of the entire population. Now, if we were to have, let's say, a group, some people make a lot of money, some people make less income. If you were to take out some of the people with less income, then overall we would see that wage increase was higher, but this would not be representative of the entire population because there would be more people that had a lower income. That's why the median wage provides a more or less, although not fully reliable, a more or less reliable tracker of wages. And looking at this graph, you can see that wage growth has typically been higher than inflation, which is a result of productivity growth. When productivity growth has been recently very weak during and after COVID, but in any case, you can see that wage growth has been moving pretty closely with this measure of underlying inflation. So Wages lag, sticky prices lag, and flexible prices lead the process. That's the general conclusion that we can reach here. We can basically consider wages to be a sticky price, and if they're a sticky price, that means in most cases, they lag behind the flexible prices. So bringing it back, we have been working on developing nonlinear models for the inflation, unemployment, and inflation output processes, where we need to construct measures of credibility. Credibility is important here because it explains the reasoning behind some of the trends in the inflation graph. So we imagine credibility is a stock. It's a function of the accumulated central bank performance. And how do we measure this performance? Well, we check to basically see if the central bank has been keeping inflation close to the target. And if there is no inflation target, like there was in the 1970s, 60s, and so on, we assume what their target was compared to their real target now. So coming back to the sticky versus flexible price chart, we can see that if we remember from the previous chart, credibility had an effect on, the inflation and the economic situation had an effect on the credibility. Credibility really tanked during the 73-74 oil crisis and didn't have time to recover before tanking again, and then didn't have time to recover again before tanking again and almost reaching rock bottom during the 1980 recession, and it took until the mid-1990s to recover a sense of credibility in the Fed. Now, also it's important to note that the credibility score, so to speak, is pretty heavily correlated with the bond market. That's why credibility has remained relatively high until very recently. If you look here, again on the same chart, we can see the late 60s up until the late 90s, sticky price inflation was more or less moving along with flexible price inflation, maybe even more. Although it was pretty anchored initially, during the 73-74 oil crisis, which we discussed earlier, credibility declined. And this decline of credibility was what caused the de-anchoring of the sticky prices. Since the Fed did not do necessarily an excellent job of handling the original 73-74 crisis, when the second shock came in 1979, credibility, as I said, fully tanked, and we can see that in this period, sticky price inflation is even more volatile than flexible price inflation. When the economy entered disinflation and long-term inflation expectations and sticky price inflation was anchored by the mid-1990s, the regime, we can say, restored its credibility, and so much that we can see that the sticky price inflation doesn't go up or down too much, not counting the very recent COVID. It more or less stays pretty anchored to the target, which can show us that credibility is pretty important in this case. The central bank, if it manages to anchor sticky price inflation, business is good in that case, so to speak. That's why another reason why it's important to think about credibility in endogenous terms, because in reality, of course, the policies that we make have an effect on central bank credibility, and we can take lessons, not only we, everyone can take lessons from the US in the 1970s and 80s in terms of the importance of anchoring sticky price inflation and keeping credibility as high as possible. So in conclusion, we agree broadly with the main points that Bernanke and Blanchard make. Prices obviously did lead the wages. That is what happens in most cases. We agree with that flexible prices lead the sticky prices in most cases, and sticky prices and our measure of wages move together, and they're highly correlated with each other, which further proves the point. So to wrap it up, the conclusion drawn by Blanchard and Bernanke makes a lot of sense, and it can be proven with statistical analysis. And the labor market then and now was indeed too hot, and it would be interesting to extend their analysis to include flexible and sticky prices, as well as what might be a better measure of wages. And that's all I have for today, so thank you very much.